Hi, everyone. Thank you for your time. I will be speaking about Japan's startup ecosystem. It would have been pretty cool if I could speak about the Indian startup ecosystem, but actually I wish I knew as much, but not that much about India's ecosystem. But I do have a point today that we look at least Fresco, which I am a part of, we look at global ecosystems, and I think that's very important. So that is one part of some of the things I'd like to present to you today. So before I actually go into the heart of the slide, a little bit about myself. I work for Fresco Capital, which is a global VC. We invest in global startups, early stage, anywhere from India or Southeast Asia to Japan to Estonia to Finland. And that is quite rare. When you think about early stage startups, they're not very global, but we do like that thesis that innovation is very global and the exit opportunities are global, so we like to connect those founders. I was also part of Mistletoe, which is a very social impact focused organization here in Japan led by Son Taizo, which is the younger brother of Son Masayoshi of SoftBank. So yeah, Japan's startup ecosystem. And then after this, we will be having a panel with really the key players of Japan's startup ecosystem. So we'll get more into the details and really kind of discuss the real difficult questions of what are the challenges we're facing right now. But to lay the groundwork, I'll give you a really brief, primitive, almost overview of Japan's startup ecosystem. So the outline, I will talk about the ecosystem. So in the ecosystem, who are the stakeholders? They are the startups, the capital part, and then the capital is both the VCs, the exits, IPOs, the mergers and acquisitions, and then all the S, which is the other. And then I'll talk about timing. Is this the right timing for Japan? And also I will talk about the culture, because with an ecosystem and with a community, there's always that culture. So what is that culture within the Japanese startup ecosystem? So starting from the startups, as you have already seen various fintech startups to AI startups today here, as you can see in Japan, we also have a diversity of startups in the last several years. When you think about it, I have the prominent ones listed over here. Mercari, probably you guys know, recently IPO'd in June. So they're, perhaps you don't want to call them a startup. They're a public company now. We'll get more into that later. But there's companies like Mercari, which is a flea market app. There's news outlets like Smart News, Free, which is a SaaS, back office type finance tool. There's Bitflyer and Coin, which are the blockchain exchange companies that are very active nowadays. So there's various kinds of startups, as you can see, and there's a simple pie chart. This is really from probably all what you know. And then, as you can imagine, with Japan, there's also the robotics companies, which have recently IPO'd in the last several years, which is kind of companies like Cyberdyne or Shaft, which was acquired by Google. So these are the companies that make up startups in Japan. What's the main point of this? It's that it's diverse, but perhaps not as robotics focused as you might, or foreigners often think when they come to Japan. We also probably don't see as much medtech or biotech startups in Japan, and we'll talk about why that is. So aside from the startups, as you know, there's various other players in this ecosystem. This is also just an overview. And the main point of this slide is that it seems like all the infrastructure or all the key players are already here in Japan now. But that's only recently, over the past 5 years. So it's really great. It's a good time now that we have all of these players. So in terms of capital or the really initial stages of startups, the key players tend to be the angel investors, the accelerators, and then you have the VCs. So you can see a lot of angels that are prominent. I guess Son Taizo, who I worked with at Mistletoe, he's one of them. Accelerators, we have plug and play now from global players coming into Japan. So that really adds another breadth to the ecosystem. And then you have all the VCs, which will come up on stage later. But you have, and then I'll talk a little bit more about that. But you also have, the media, like Tech in Asia and all these other outlets to share the information about what's going on, which is very important. And also, events and conferences like today, as you guys all know, for startups, marketing and PR is a big part, especially if you're doing 2C businesses, even if it is also SaaS enterprise type businesses. It's all an important factor. So we're having that in Japan. And this is all very recent on the last 5 or so years. And also in the last layer I have is the government support that we're seeing. METI, the Ministry of Economics, Trade, and Industry, is being very aggressive and in promoting startups and making sure that they are given the resources that they need and perhaps even the regulatory frameworks to thrive. And then we have obviously the large corporates that are sponsoring these conferences. And we have educational universities that are also working with startups. There are VCs coming out of universities. So like I said, the moral of this page's story is that all the players are finally in Japan. We didn't have a lot of these infrastructure type players in Japan until very recently. So now it's starting to mature. But maybe some of you guys already know this. Briefly for the capital part, rough number that you guys probably have in your head is that in Japan, over the past several years, it's been around $2 billion US in investments made into startups, which is significant for Japan. As you can see, it's been growing, but it's still much more magnitude smaller than the US or China. So it's not even tenfold, but it's like 50 to 80 times different compared to the US and China. So we will talk a little bit more about what we mean, what does this mean. So this, again, sorry, I'm filling up for a great India startup ecosystem panel. So these are really just simple figures, but so VCs, the amount invested is $2 billion, and where they're coming from is a majority of them, like the red that you see, are CVCs. The rest are banks or financial institutions, like not just your mega banks, but your local chigins, and then you have other industries and other universities, et cetera. So CVCs. I don't want to get too caught up into this. Maybe it will be part of the panel. But the CVCs are corporate venture capital, so they have a different kind of mindset to perhaps the venture capitals that you know in the West or other parts of the world where they're going for the home run returns. So CVCs, perhaps they have an agenda to do a synergistic partnership with a startup or gather information into a certain field which is relevant to them. So they're not looking to make too much of a high risk type investment. So that is part of the culture that disseminates into Japan's startup ecosystem. We can talk more about that later, but these are just numbers. And capital, but luckily because $2 billion being invested yearly, the size of the rounds and the valuations are growing. So that is a positive sign. That means startups are getting much more resources to do a lot of things, from hiring to even R&D type projects to also investing in marketing, which is all important. So we're at a good time now. And then we can talk about exits. I just mentioned Mercari's IPO, very successful in June. The share price right now, it's, the earnings came out and perhaps, but we'll see. But it's very positive for the ecosystem because, we see a very positive startup that was growing very fast only in the last, 3-4 years since their birth, listing. A lot of their team, have become, through their stock options, have become, very successful and perhaps can give back to the ecosystem. So that's also very positive. And hopefully we'll see more of this. I know unicorns is something that we all love to talk about. So in Japan, there are other unicorns right now. I'm sure we'll talk about them in our panel. But this is really, this presentation is just to lay the groundwork. And so we see IPOs. We'll talk about unicorns. Another thing we would like to see probably is more M&As by corporates. So corporates are making their CVCs, venture capital arms. It would be really great if they were also making acquisitions so that we can see more exits, so that VCs can take more risk. in investing, and et cetera, et cetera. It would be a great cycle for the ecosystem. And timing, you guys probably all know this. Like I said earlier, like I mentioned earlier, the government is really supporting innovation and startup in Japan. So J Startup is our sponsor for this event, and they are helping startups with access to information, access to resources, and helping them go global, which is not something we've seen a lot, and that is something that I would like to talk about in the next panel, because as Fresco, we invest in global startups. We think global markets obviously is larger, and the possibility of exits through mergers and acquisitions, et cetera, globally are much, much more bigger and interesting. But anyways, the point of this story, this slide, is that the government is supporting it. And they are coming up with more concrete steps of what they will follow. They're perhaps emulating the French tech system or other ecosystems that have been successful. So it's a really great time for Japanese startups. So I would like to close off probably this presentation and lead into the next panel by talking about, with this ecosystem, what kind of culture do we have? What can we even do more? So I think in terms of culture, it's an exciting space. That is definitely a point that can be witnessed right now. So many great conferences like this happening right now. So there's a lot of great attention and excitement in the space. And that fear of failure is being kind of offset by by excitement. So I want to do a startup. It sounds exciting. It seems cool. So that's great. And that can even be put even more accelerated, I think, through a lot of work style reforms that the government is working on. If people form corporations, join startups, if people, what we're seeing right now are people like investment bankers coming into the space. I was also one, and this is so much more funner, to be honest, in this space. So yeah, we're seeing a lot more people come in, less of a fear of failure and being more excited. So that's great. That's a new culture, relatively new in Japan. But I think we do need more diversity. Hence, maybe you can tell I'm a female. So it's not just about gender, but about, all these nationalities, people from outside of Japan coming in to start startups, whether it could be age, it could be all types of inclusivity and diversity in thought is really necessary when you're trying to do something innovative. And so I hope we see more of that in Japan as well. And also another thing I hope to see a little bit more of is kind of a plus-sum mindset and a pay-it-forward mindset in Japan. I talked about the Mercari's IPO, giving birth to a lot of great, successful individuals, and hopefully they'll pay it forwards to the ecosystem by becoming angel investors, etc. That kind of cycle is less prominent in Japan because there haven't been very many exits, but hopefully there will be more, and other things that, not just angel investing, but sharing of information, not just through these conferences, but offline or in small circles, just sharing about the knowledge is a little bit less seen in Japan. It's a bit more quiet and closed, perhaps. Maybe some of you have noticed. If we could be more active in talking about our learnings, even our failures as VCs, for example, or even entrepreneurs, if that is more shared openly, I think it would lead to an even further richer ecosystem. But otherwise, I think it's a great time to be in the startup space in Japan. And there's various fields that one could look into. I think a lot of fun discussions will happen in the panel following us. So thank you for your time. That's about it. Thank you.